And I wonder, Ruben, listening to that, what you make of that argument, because I know that Pele has been criticised in the past for not talking overtly about racism, for example, but I wonder what you make of the perspective of Tim Vickery there, that actually, in his own way, Pele did a lot. He was always a campaigner for the most deprived in Brazil, for example. Are we asking too much of our football stars? They're footballers after all, aren't they? They're not politicians.
Yeah, I think we asked too much, so I have to agree on that one. I just want to ask Tim something, if that's possible, because I always understood that because of that famous loss in 1950, that it were mostly the black players who were seen as guilty or responsible for that loss, and that with the win in 1958 and Pelé as one of the big stars, or probably the big star of that team, that he also managed to turn the view towards black people in the country. Is that completely not true, or is there some truth in it?
There is some truth in it. There have been two moments when the black Brazilian has been really included in the imaginary ideal of the nation. One was in the 30s, when samba became the national soundtrack, and the other is the late 60s, early 70s, with Pele leading that Mexico 70 triumph, which is the first one seen on television live in Brazil and in many places around the world. And interestingly, these two moments, the 30s and late 60s, early 70s, are the moments when Brazil had its most authoritarian governments. Now, this is a debate that rages in Brazil. This idea, this imaginary idea of a racial democracy, is this positive or is it negative? It's negative in the sense that it doesn't really reflect reality. I mean, even in football, you see very, very few black coaches. In wider society, it's very hard. It's starting to change, but it's still very hard to see black people in positions of power. The legacy of enslavement is something which really very little has been done. The former slaves are still at the bottom of the pile, with a huge lack of public investment in education, in things that could change that. So on the one hand, that racial democracy idea is a myth, but on the other, I think there's probably something positive in the inclusion in the imaginary sense of the nation, that black Brazilians have an important place there. It's a complex debate, and it's one that I don't think is easy to resolve. And for me, the key point is what Pele did by example. And this is, to my mind, a tribute to the democratic nature of football itself. It's a game you don't need money, you don't need sophisticated equipment, it's open to all shapes and sizes. So the fact that someone born 52 years after the abolition of slavery can leave the stage as the undisputed king of the global game, I think has a huge power of example. And it's up to Brazilian society to open the pathways through education for that example to be duplicated in other areas of human life.
Indeed, Tim, and let me bring Jean-Emile, Jammine in on that question, broaden this out a little bit. But I wonder, Jean-Emile, whether you think that his sort of overt silence when it came to politics, when it came to issues of race, was that what allowed him to sort of transcend those divisions in society that Tim Vickery is talking about? Was his silence part of the reason why he was so loved?
Oh, you'll have to ask each and every individual Brazilian, I'm sure, and person across the world for their own opinion on that. I mean, he was, by his silence, criticized very much upon receiving that 1970 World Cup when he went back to Brazil, and it was Emilio Garrastazu Medici who handed him that trophy. He was one of the most ruthless dictators at the time. And basically, people pointed to that and said, when you're silent on issues like that, you actually end up showing your politics. But then at the same time, he has never really aligned himself to any kind of political movement. Of course, he was the sports minister, as both Tim and Ruben mentioned, in 1995 under a centre-right government, but then also branded himself as a socialist. It's never really clear, and ultimately, when you do align yourself with a political movement, you are bound to get any kind of reaction either way. It's a no-win situation, really, because you are at the forefront of having a voice. You are basically the first massive icon of sports in terms of Pele. He was the first millionaire footballer upon joining New York Cosmos, and that basically elevated him to the top. So anything that he said, anything that he did, he had to lead by a certain kind of example. Could he have done it in any other way to have the kind of reputation that he did? I would say probably not.